to decriminalize marijuana for recreational use globally is gaining momentum fast. In the US alone, 3 more states have done so within the last week. Now, the city of New York has announced that people carrying small amounts of marijuana will no longer be arrested or face criminal charges, marking a significant shift in how the nation's biggest city approaches policing Dagga. The legalization of marijuana is without doubt a global debate that every week, in fact every day, raises new questions on the matter. The debate is also having a voice here in South Africa. Many will tell you that we are still far away and that a lot needs to happen here. We at Newsroom have been leading this discussion and have given a voice to those passionate individuals, organizations for as well as against legalization. Now, joining us today to talk about social policies behind decriminalization of marijuana as a harm reduction strategy is clinical psychologist in community service, Quentin Ferreira. A very good morning to you.
Hi, Eben.
Quentin, just some background. I understand there's research being done on harm reduction strategies, and one of them is the decriminalization of marijuana.
Yes, before I get into that though, Eben, I just must say that I am a community service clinical psychologist, so I'm employed by the Department of Health. And while I can back up everything I will say with research from peer-reviewed journals, this is not the official stance from the Department of Health. This is my personal view as a professional.
That is noted.
So to answer your question about this research, what the research suggests is that although cannabis is not completely safe, a lot of the harms that we associate with cannabis are actually a result of the laws that decriminalize cannabis and can't be attributed to cannabis itself.
Yeah.
So the people leading this kind of research are people involved in mental health. You get people like psychiatrists, psychopharmacologists, psychologists, sociologists as well joining this. I think worldwide, one of the experts is Professor David Nutt, who, despite his unfortunate surname, has written extensively on the subject and has a book out called Drugs Without the Hot Air that speaks a lot about this policy.
Yeah.
And it's not just in theory, it's happening in practice. We see with Portugal, who decriminalized drugs 10 years ago, they've managed to halve their addiction rates. As a Portuguese descendant, I'm quite proud of this. At least their drug policy is better than their football team.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, we talk about addiction quickly because I think that's the one thing that worries people a lot.
Sure.
You've worked with rehab centers, right?
Yes.
Is marijuana addiction, well, in these cases, when you deal with addiction, is marijuana addiction one of those that you see?
Look, I think it is certainly one of those that you see, but you must remember it's a numbers game. Because cannabis is the most widely used illicit drug, and the research says about 9% of people who do use it can have some problematic use with it.
Yeah.
That must be contrasted with 15% of people who form alcohol dependence, though.
9% versus 50%?
Yeah, 15.
15, okay.
15%.
Oh, it's very close.
So you will see certain people coming to the attention of rehabilitation centers for cannabis. Not usually cannabis alone, but certainly they do come to our attention. And a lot of the times it's a diversion case where they're brought to the court attention and they're given the option of going to rehab or to prison, which I think is a step in the right direction. But the drugs that concern me most at the moment are things like cat, alcohol, and heroin in Gauteng. Because the people that use those drugs are likely to suffer a lot more negative effects, they're much more likely to come to your attention. And the withdrawal syndrome from something like alcohol, heroin, or even benzodiazepines can kill you.
Yeah.
It's literally a medical emergency in some cases. Whereas for cannabis, you'll find that although there are withdrawal symptoms, they're manageable, irritating, sometimes distressing for people, so they don't usually come to the attention of people like me for cannabis use alone, although it does happen.
Now, let's talk about harm reduction strategies again. What are the benefits there that we are hoping to see?
Well, I think that the benefits of those are on an individual and a societal level. First of all, I think the most harmful thing about cannabis is that it's in the hands of the black market. So when you see that, you see huge profits for organized crime from the sale of cannabis.
Yeah.
People fighting with dangerous weapons against the police because there's a lot of money in the hands of some dangerous criminals.
Yeah.
And so an attack on that is an economic attack on the black market. It also frees up the police and the courts and resources for drug research, drug treatment, and drug education, which is what I think we need. Another unintended harm of that, of course, is because cannabis is in the hands of the black market, those people who go to drug dealers to buy their cannabis, the drug dealers have a profit motive in mind, so they're more likely to push harder drugs and more addictive drugs onto people. And also from an individual point of view, we want to keep cannabis out of the hands of the youth. We know that any drug that a person uses from a young age has the potential to cause more negative effects.
Yeah.
People are more vulnerable as young people to addiction.
On that note, let's close by talking about your expertise, mental health.
Sure.
People are worried. It drives you crazy, smoking too much marijuana or even using it by other means. I mean, many other ways to take it.
Well, Eben, I think that's quite a misunderstanding. And I do think that that's a misunderstanding of mental illness as a whole, not just of cannabis. So in something like schizophrenia, which the argument is usually cannabis causes schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Schizophrenia is definitely a problematic mental illness that affects 1% of the population, regardless of whether they smoke cannabis or not. And schizophrenia has a genetic component, so people born with a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia and who abuse drugs like cannabis or even alcohol, they are more likely to have a psychotic episode. So it's a biological factor interacting with an environmental factor that causes people with this genetic predisposition to become mentally ill. It's not to say that cannabis itself will cause that, and the reason I say that is because since the 1960s, cannabis use has been rising incrementally in the world. Personally, I blame the Beatles and Bob Dylan for that. But we don't see a corresponding rise in the rates of schizophrenia as we see with the increased rates of cannabis, which says that if A causes B, when A increases, B should increase. We don't see that with schizophrenia and cannabis.
Well, that's Quentin Ferreiro is a clinical psychologist talking to us about the Dagga debate. Of course, on all our social pages is where you can get involved with the discussion. Thank you once again, Quentin, for coming
Thank you,
this morning. Let's have a look at what